Привет, Сири, включи свет в комнате. Привет, Сири, включи свет в комнате.
So, a week ago, I decided to participate in my first ever GameJam. It was hosted by Andre from Mix and Jam, who I had the fortune to meet and hang out during my visit to Unite Copenhagen, along with other similarly talented and awesome people, all of whom turned out to be amazing human beings in person. Miss you guys already. Long story short, the theme of this particular GameJam was dimension change. Take a game mechanic from one dimension and recreate it in another. And we, as participants of the jam, had only 48 hours spread over the weekend to submit our entries. As I am solely a 3D guy, it was a no-brainer that I would take some 2D game and overhaul it in 3D and not the other way around. The theme of the jam might sound simple, but in reality it's a tricky one. Almost any gameplay mechanic you can think of has already been transported from 2D to 3D since the golden age of polygonal revolution. I prepared myself for a lengthy brainstorm session, started remembering all the games I loved playing, and my mind got immediately drawn to the memories of the Bomberman game series. I really loved the mechanic of placing a bomb and running away until it exploded in my face. So, after a quick Google search, I found tons of remakes, but not one of which was true 3D. They were all using 3D graphics, but only for visuals. The gameplay was still on a 2D plane without any verticality. That settled it. I would remake the Bomberman corridor explosion mechanic, but in a true 3D fashion. But there was a catch. I had most of Sunday, but only some of Saturday at my disposal. That meant I would have to be really methodical and ordered in my approach, so I would not get stuck on a single well, it's not exactly a problem, is it? More like an issue, obstacle, whatever, on a single katsenyama for too long. I would either have to scratch the thing or try another approach. One other thing I decided for myself during the jam was not to use any paid assets and only to use fundamental third-party stuff to eliminate the unnecessary grind. That decision came in part because I wanted to put myself into the position where I had to constantly question myself if what I'm doing really adds to the gameplay and is worth the limited time. And the other reason is that anything third-party is generally too, general? For most of the assets to be flexible enough to be used in a wide range of projects, they tend to be bulky with all kind of bells and whistles. So I figured it could take me more time to understand the inner workings of the asset than it would take me to create it from scratch, just for my needs, just the bare necessities. The thing I did first was to install the progress package. From the very beginning I decided that I'll be using 1 meter grid for everything, and that would save me a lot of time in both level creation and code generation, cause if everything is locked to those positions, it makes that stuff that much more predictable. I'm also making this project in the lightweight render pipeline, which, by the way, will be renamed to a much more suitable universal render pipeline very soon. The reasoning? I guess I will be needing that sweet shader graph later in the project. Plus, it's just great to see it out of preview, and I love adopting anything new and shiny. So, for the player movement, I decided to check out Unity's built-in character controller, but I quickly realized that I won't be using it. I had no experience with it, and I feared it would just drag me down. So what I started making instead is the simplest rigid-body FPS controller you could ever think of. At this point I only needed movement in all 4 directions working, at least somewhat satisfactory. So fortunately, I encountered little resistance from the code and was happy with the time it took me. After tweaking the parameters to my liking, I was ready to tackle the next thing. No FPS controller is complete without a decent mouse look method, and thankfully once again, this was quite easy to implement due to how low were my requirements for this controller. This game can easily do without head bobbing, cleaning mechanics or aiming animations. It just needs to convert mouse input into smooth rotations. I supplied myself with some basic public variables and played around with their values in the editor until I found the right speed and feel. Happy with the results and about how everything until this point was going pretty smoothly, I was ready to move on to the meat of the project: bombs and explosions. Here's the question for you: what came first, the bomb or the explosion? The bomb, of course it's the bomb. So that's what I started with next. The same as with the cubes for the walls and stuff, I wanted the bombs to snap onto a grid too. For that, I needed to write a simple script that would just round the position of where the camera is looking at to the nearest whole number. Pay attention to the thin green line that comes out of the camera. It will always snap to a grid point right in front of the player's face, and will turn red if it's inside any of the other geometries, signaling that we can't put the bomb there. All we need now is to snap our bomb into the place and add a smoothing function to make the snapping from one grid point to another a pleasant sight. At this point in time, I made a little break from coding and started setting up the post-processing. That bland prototype look can get old pretty quick, so I try to change the visuals, at least ever so slightly, every now and then. Okay, now back to explosions. My first instinct was to just create a growing sphere denoting the radius of explosion, which is pretty simple in itself. Then I add a block of code to check if that explosion sphere overlaps any of the other colliders, and delete the blocks that are breakable. By the way, only the sand color blocks will be destructible down the line. Then out of nowhere I remembered that my player controller was lacking one significant feature: jumping. Never ever in my life do I want to get back to those dark ages when games deliberately excluded jumping. And thankfully, that was also a pretty quick update, cause all I needed was to add an upward force to my character's rigid body and do a simple raycast check to make sure the player was touching the ground. Next I needed to create some level geometry to test the newly created explosions and their logic. I liked how it all looked and worked, but I couldn't get over the fact that the explosion sphere was clipping through the geometry. The player could be standing on one side of the wall, and he would be able to see the explosion sphere coming from the other side, and that's just not how we roll. But it was already quite late, and I decided that it was enough for the evening of first day. I will have much more time tomorrow, and I'm sure I will come up with something on a fresh brain in the morning. The new day begins, and I jump straight in, resuming my work by creating an aptly named function called explosion2. This time I will try to create a dynamic, geometry-aware explosion. The idea is to start from the initial point and grow my explosion in all directions, while simultaneously checking for collisions. I hope that if I'll spread this over multiple frames, it should not tax the CPU too much, and I might even get a decent result visually. I added a little movement to the individual explosion spheres, and to my surprise it started to look and perform quite nice from the very first tests. Guys, before we move forward, I need to make a confession about the choppy gameplay footage you're seeing now. The thing is, to save this space, I recorded my screen at 6 FPS for these time lapses. But I also made occasional builds of my project, so that I can record regular gameplay footage at a normal frame rate later. But unfortunately, I'm an idiot, and I didn't check any of the builds until around the middle of the development. And all of them contain just the default scene that comes with lightweight render pipeline, and not the game itself. It'll be much better in the second part of the video, but right now you'll have to soldier on just a little bit more. Okay, back to video. And I have my first, and thankfully the only Unity freeze caused by an infinitely looping function my stupid brain coded. Next few hours were spent getting the explosion to look and behave in somewhat believable and predictable way. I experimented a lot with the general shape and the size and how it affected the performance. I tweaked the speed at which the explosion travels through the air and tried my best to control the individual explosion spheres so they would not clip through the level geometry. All that while keeping in mind that I wanted to have a build of the game playable inside the browser. I also started tweaking the visual style of the explosion, trying to find a nice balance between simple and stylish. And somewhere around this time, I realized that I hated that bomb snapping mechanic, cause it obstructs the view way too much and frantically moves around the screen like a rabid squirrel. So instead I decided to literally put the bomb in the player's hands, which just even sounds cooler. And as a cherry on top, give the player an ability to throw it with variable strength by holding the fire button. Now, initially I thought that given enough time, I'll focus on designing the gameplay around fighting some enemies. But in case of little time, I'll repurpose the mechanic for a puzzle platformer. Seeing that at this point I had only just over 6 hours left till the deadline, and I had no game whatsoever, the direction was obvious. I guessed that I was primarily done with most of the crucial logic, so I went back round to visuals, and the first order of business were these solid blocks. As I was now doing a puzzle platformer, I wanted the player to see how the explosion spreads and use the transparent walls to his advantage in the upcoming puzzles. But just setting the transparency of the standard material didn't cut it, so I fired up that sweet shader graph. At first I tried to make a semi-transparent glass material by using camera depth information, but I quickly scrapped that idea in favor of doing something less complex. I also decided that my cubes will greatly benefit from having a bit of a bevel on their edges, for that additional geometry the light could bounce off. I proceeded to make a custom shader, which would almost imitate the standard one, except for some extended control over a few of the parameters, and once I started tweaking, everything kind of fell in place. Simultaneously I went around adjusting the skybox and all other materials. Breakable sand color cubes became pink to contrast the light blue color of the glass walls. I cranked up that post-processing bloom to smooth out the edges and give it a richer look. The ground had also to be much darker and duller to contrast with the interactable geometry. I played around with different skybox settings and colors, but eventually decided that it just had to retire in favor of same colored walls as the ground, to give me that much needed foreground-background separation. To help me with some quality of life improvements, I installed the super awesome Do-Twin asset, and now began the final coding stretch of my journey. So here goes, blitz round of features. First of all, I needed to get me some of that sweet camera shake. This is where Do-Twin asset comes in to save the day and a ton of precious time for me. Next, I had to add a cooldown, so not to have players spawning bombs into oblivion. Because players now have the ability to hold down the fire button to throw bombs farther, I needed to convey that information somehow. I really didn't want to have any UI elements cluttering the screen, so what I ended up doing is gradually changing the bomb's color to simulate it getting more hot. Got to give the player a chance to outrun explosions by holding that shift key. Animated bomb bobbing while the player is moving to give that secondary motion feel, just because. And last but not least, I have added the death logic if the player was unfortunate enough to be caught in the self-made explosion, and this concluded my final coding stretch. Now for some visual polish. I quickly jumped into Blender to create a more bumpy bomb in place of the temporary sphere I was using all this time. And I really needed to begin the level design, for which, by the way, I had less than a few hours left before I would have to stop developing and try fixing any bugs I might encounter along the way, and especially during the export of the build. But before that, I didn't want to have a game without a start screen and a completion screen, which I made, but then remade, and then demade back again. Finally, before I could start making the levels, I needed to create one last block. This one could be destroyed only from one side, which would allow me to develop interesting puzzles. And then it dawned upon me, I forgot to make some kind of a goal, a trigger, to mark the completion of current level and the start of the next one. Obviously running low on time, I just created a cube, stretched it out, and splurged all out on the bloom effect. Now I was finally ready to design some levels. With only 1 hour left, not counting the reserved extra emergency hour for the builds and all that jazz, I jumped straight in. I managed to create a total of 6 levels, each one introducing a new mechanic or solution to the puzzle. And to be honest with you, this was the most fun of the whole jam. Cause when everything was already working, I got immediate feedback from my actions, without needing to figure out how to fix this and that. And I would be lying if I said that I wasn't feeling a bit down, that I didn't have more time for at least a 10 level run. But on the other hand, I was super pumped that I managed to create a coherent experience in such a little time frame. While waiting for the build to compile, I wasted no time and quickly prepared a simple page on itch.io. To my surprise, the game exported and uploaded without any hiccups, and I was able to enter the jam with just about 10 minutes left till deadline. Here's a super quick walkthrough of the game, but if you want to experience the game for yourself, just follow the link in the description. The game is playable right from your browser. Sadly, I didn't have any time for sound effects and music, but I kinda already knew that since I even started the project. My priorities were first on gameplay, looks and feel. All in all, it took me 16 hours for all the game dev stuff, plus roughly an hour spent exporting the builds, uploading, testing, fixing, and setting up the itch.io page for the submission. Which is funny, because this video alone took me more than twice that amount. Guys, please leave a comment if you'd like to see this prototype turned into a full-fledged game, and especially if you have any ideas on what you would like me to add or experiment with. Also, stay tuned for my next videos. I still owe you guys a tutorial on a fully procedural road shader made completely in shader graph. A huge shout out to all my patrons. If you'd only knew how good it is knowing you have my back. One love, guys. To summarize, taking part in GameJam for the first time resulted in me having the time of my life, and it allowed me to experience a much needed fresh perspective on things. I encourage anyone who scoffed at the idea of jams to try it out for themselves. You'd be extremely surprised. So a huge thank you goes out to Andre for organizing such a cool jam. Check out his channel Mix and Jam along with other amazing developers I listed down below. Lastly, don't forget to click the usual buttons under the video. Check out all the links in the description, and guys, keep on being awesome. Peace out.